Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to have Noelle Hunter present. Today's webinar is called Integrating Peer-Informed Approaches to Crisis into Clinical Work, and it will be hosted by the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery. I'm Shira Collings, and I'll be the moderator of this webinar. If you want to go on to the next slide, we just have some housekeeping.
Oh, me?
So this webinar will be recorded and we'll be putting it on our website. The PowerPoint presentation is available for download, and the audio recording of the teleconference will be emailed to you and posted at ncmhr.org. We will also be emailing you certificates of attendance following the webinar. So you should receive that within 24 hours, sometime later today or tomorrow. Let us know if you don't receive that for some reason. At the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A session. You're invited to ask questions at any time through the question function. And if we don't get to every question, which we may not be able to, I think there's almost 300 people registered for this webinar. So there might be a lot of questions that we can't take all of them. So please email the presenter. Noelle's contact information will be provided at the end of the slides. So I want to introduce our presenter. Noelle Hunter is a clinical psychologist working in private practice in New York City. She provides workshops and keynote speeches on the topics of developmental trauma, alternative and humanistic approaches to healing, and mental health advocacy. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, and she is the author of the book Trauma and Madness in Mental Health Services. I think Oryx will provide a link to her book. It's really great. Definitely check it out. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Noelle.
Hi, everybody. My hair's a different color these days. It's not important, but I feel the need to point that out in case you didn't notice. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and excited to be able to go over some of this information because we don't always hear it a lot, especially in standard clinical training. Me personally, I do have a background of my own crises, which is actually what led me to become a psychologist in the first place. I had both not great experiences during that time, and I had some very helpful experiences during that time. And that has certainly informed the approach that I have taken throughout my training and as well as my clinical work now. But it's a small piece of the puzzle. A lot of my work is and what I'm going to talk to you about today is informed by research that's being done that's using first-person perspectives, as well as various different groups that I have been fortunate to be a part of and also follow and attend their trainings and services. Some of the ones that I'd like to, if you haven't heard of them, I'd like you to check them out. The first is the Hearing Voices Network. I used to be on the board. They're a great organization around the world that provide peer-led groups and trainings on extreme experiences. Also NARPA, which is the National Association for Rights Protection Advocacy. I'm on the board with them right now, and they are about legal rights for people who have disabilities or are diagnosed with severe mental illnesses. And locally, there's a group called IDA. I love them. They're wonderful. Check them out, IDHA. I can never remember what it actually stands for, but they are absolutely amazing and doing some really pioneering work here in New York, also about peer-led services. So what we're talking about today, basically, is crisis and using these first-person perspectives to inform how do we deal with crises. However, before we get to how we deal with crises, I think it's important first to consider what we're talking about when we talk about crisis. So I just want, it's a little complicated with this whole webinar thing to go back and forth trying to get some actual responses right now, so I apologize. But I do want you to think on your own. What comes to your mind when you think about crisis? What are some of the initial images or circumstances that immediately pop up for you? you might be surprised that there's actually a lot of different ways that a person might fall into crisis. One might be about behaviors. So the typical things we might think of with suicidality, actual suicide attempts, some kind of threat of harm to self or other, and current ongoing abuse or domestic violence. However, there's also emotional crises, and this is where somebody might not actually have overt problems in their life, but their problems are very much inside, and it is threatening their existence in some kind of way. And that's when they're having some kind of really intense or overwhelming emotional distress. It might be in the form of traumatic flashbacks. It might be in the form of panic attacks. It might also be in the form of intense fear that is very confusing and overwhelming. It might also be intense excitement that is also hard to contain sometimes. There's also cognitive crises. So this might just be thoughts of death or suicide, thoughts of intense trauma or mass destruction around one, confusion, intense dissociation, so kind of being foggy or out of it or feeling like things aren't real, or having an entirely alternative reality, what some people might call psychosis. There's also spiritual crises. So this is more of the existential type. It could be religious in nature. It might just be, what is the meaning of life? What is my purpose here? I think a lot of people are experiencing some existential crises now, especially in the United States, not just because of COVID, but there's plenty of other things going on that might make us wonder, what is the point to it all? Or why are things seemingly not fair, and what does that mean about life and morals, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess here I put existential as separate from spiritual. I do see them somewhat as the same, but further on the existential is kind of that loss of identity, or who am I? Who am I within this world that we live in? And that can be really, really scary. And it does happen a lot for people who are in their late teens and early 20s, but also it happens to older individuals when there's some kind of big life change, or some kind of event happens that really makes a person question, who am I, and what am I here for? Or maybe it shatters a person's worldview. And then there's, of course, environmental crises. There's a lot of that happening right now too, with the massive increases in unemployment, the homelessness that's particularly going to go on the rise in the next couple of weeks as evictions start to take place, divorce, the death of a loved one, and lockdown, this intense isolation that a lot of people are experiencing. So if you think about these, there's so many different ways a person might be in crisis. And most of those times, it's going to lead a person to either voluntarily or involuntarily come into contact with mental health services and wanting some kind of help. I think it's important to understand whether you are the person who is coming for help or you are the person who's giving help, that clinicians are people first. I think we tend to have this idea, this message out there in the proverbial world that's that clinicians can handle anything, or that we're just supposed to kind of know what to do and always be calm and always be at our best at any given moment. And I think that unrealistic expectation sometimes in and of itself leads to a lot of problems. I think if we can all accept that clinicians are people, then we can understand that in all likelihood, when somebody comes to us as clinicians in a state of crisis, it's going to bring intense emotions for everybody. It is not surprising that a clinician might start to have their own fear when somebody is really panicking or is suicidal. That's scary. I mean, to pretend that that isn't scary is just it's false. And I think the more transparency one can have and say, yeah, this is really scary, but I also can handle it, is a great kind of modeling, as well as it gives permission to the clinician to be human. The clinician also has their own existential anxieties. I wrote a paper with a very good friend of mine and colleague, so a couple years back. It's called Transactional Experiences of Existential Anxiety as a Barrier to Effective Humanistic Intervention. It's a very complicated title. But basically, the article goes into this idea of how clinicians coming to a crisis with their own background, their own trauma histories, their own emotions, their own existential anxieties, and coming into the room with somebody who has their intense existential anxieties, and how these can really clash, and how this ends up in sometimes a power battle, or sometimes the clinician not being able to see or hear what's in front of them because it threatens their own worldviews or moral or religious beliefs or what have you. And this becomes very quickly a big problem, and can make crises actually even worse rather than helping contain a crisis situation. Helplessness is probably one of the worst feelings anybody can ever feel. I think a lot of what we do in life is to defend against feelings of helplessness, because it's just such an intolerable feeling. And so when somebody's coming to us and they're losing their job, they're losing their house, they're so overwhelmed with such an intense trauma history that all they want to do is die, and there's so little you can do in that moment to make it go away. It's such a terrible feeling. But if we can own it and work with it, it's a lot more helpful than being reactive to that place, because sometimes a lot of coercion, a lot of force, a lot of those power battles can sometimes come from clinicians wanting to defend against those terrible feelings of helplessness or guilt even. Typically, when a person comes to a mental health professional in a state of crisis, especially if it's more of the behavioral type, there are certain protocols that we are trained to use, especially if a person's working in a hospital or a standard clinic, that can sometimes be helpful and sometimes maybe not as much. In general, the typical protocols that clinicians are trained to use tend to be bringing objective questionnaires into the room. So suicide assessment questionnaires or safety assessment questionnaires. And these very much, I think, tend to help with that sense of helplessness for the clinician. It gives the clinician something to do. It gives the clinician something to kind of hold on to, especially if they're feeling afraid. And I think in that way, it actually can be very helpful, because if we are in our own state of fear, we can kind of get lost in our own heads and not be able to be there for a person. So if we have something tangible to hold on to, that can be very useful in that moment. We also tend to be taught that when a person's coming in a state of crisis, that we should immediately also contact a psychiatrist or refer to a psychiatrist to have them evaluated for possible medications. And in more extreme circumstances, we are often mandated to call the police and have the person admitted to a hospital, either voluntarily, preferred, or involuntarily. Again, if you're working in a hospital or a standard clinic. The results of these practices tend to be mixed. On the positive side, like I said, they might be able to help the clinician with his or her own fears or anxieties, which can be very helpful to the overall emotional intensity of the situation. They provide quick information. If we're not able to maybe think of the right, quote unquote, right questions to ask, or maybe a person just feels uncomfortable talking about death themselves, if maybe the person coming for help is reluctant to talk about things, sometimes pulling out a questionnaire can help them feel more comfortable acknowledging some of the things that they might be going through. So it can help provide some quick information sometimes. It also helps the clinicians to feel empowered. I have a clinical tool in front of me that I can use. I know how to use this. I can either ask the questions myself or hand it to you and you can just fill it out. And that empowerment for the clinician actually also can be very helpful within reason. However, there's some not so great results of these standard practices. When a person is really scared and overwhelmed and having these emotional extremes and thoughts of death and trauma reminders, and then they're met with that kind of cold clinical, all right, well, we're going to now do this assessment to see what's going on for you. That can feel very isolating. It can feel even rejecting sometimes. That here I am coming to a person in a place of extraordinary vulnerability and fear, and I'm met with kind of this unemotional response. It feels off, and it can make the person feel even more distant, crazy even, and it can sometimes make a person close down, shut down. It can make them fall into crisis even more. It can feel very dehumanizing a lot of times, especially if somebody is coming and they're saying, listen, I have all of this experience of abuse and it's coming back to me and I don't know what to do with it, and I'm cutting myself, or I'm afraid of everybody around me, or whatever it might be that's happening. And the response that the person is met with is, well, it seems like you need to be on medication. I mean, that's so dehumanizing. And it's not, I'm not for or against medication. That's not where I'm going with any of this. But when that is kind of the standard or immediate response to such a situation, it can be very dehumanizing. Knowing that the clinician might send a person to a hospital oftentimes tends to lead to people who are seeking help not always being very honest, or knowing that they can't acknowledge or admit certain things for fear that that means they're going to get locked up. And when they can't actually talk about what's going on, or they don't feel safe or comfortable really verbalizing very scary things, they're still stuck with it all alone. And it's oftentimes in that sharing that a lot of relief can come. With the person feels like they can't be honest with the therapist or clinician, and or if a clinician responds to something in such a way that suddenly feels rejecting or feels coercive in some kind of way, it can really lead to the destruction of that therapeutic relationship, which in the long run, that relationship arguably might be the most important thing in that person's healing process. With a lot of these things, even at the end of the day, if we're talking about suicide questionnaires or violence questionnaires or things of that matter, the statistics regarding these are mixed, to say the best, but in general, they're not shown to be very useful. They don't really predict much, if anything at all, and it does tend to be about just slightly more than chance or flip of a coin as to what somebody answers on a questionnaire versus whether they're actually going to do something violent towards themselves or somebody else. So my my dissertation for my doctoral program, I interviewed people from around the world. Back in the day where not everybody was using this video conferencing. And I asked, it was people who had significant dissociative experiences, many of whom had been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder at some point, and or had been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. Every single one of these people had extensive histories with therapy, with hospitalizations, with many, many different kinds of crises over the years. And they were all in various places of recovery when I did these interviews. And the big part of what I was trying to look for is what they found helpful and not so helpful in treatment with clinicians. And all of them had both helpful, not helpful, and everything in between experiences. And in general, what I found and in this is definitely in line with a lot of the other uh, uh, qualitative studies that have been done, or people who have written from their own first person perspectives about their experiences. It all seems to pretty much say the same thing, that the things that are most helpful are usually not big, huge things that we can easily say, yes, I did this thing and now there's a result. It's usually the more subtle things, like feeling heard, being able to feel safe in some kind of way. That might be being able to feel safe in here, feeling safe in the clinician office, finding some place of safety within a person's home or school or wherever it is that they might be, figuring out maybe it's having a weighted blanket or a stuffed animal or some kind of something that helps them feel grounded and safe. Uh, Trusting relationships. It's the number one thing across the board. Trusting relationships is the most helpful thing when people are going through crises, in order for them to be able to heal and come back from these crises. Along with that is feeling supported, not feeling like they're all alone in it. Feeling understood, having attunement, being able to actually speak about their problems without somebody feeling like they immediately need to fix them. Uh, uh, Having some kind of place that they could go for respite. Sometimes that might be a hospital. Some people do find that to be helpful. And sometimes there are places where there are peer respites, where it's they can leave anytime they want. It's not necessarily required that somebody take medications, but it's sort of supported if they do. And it's a place for them to kind of get away from it all for a little while and be amongst other people who will listen and support them while they're going through what it is they're going through. So with that is also that feeling of that they're being held in some kind of way. Feeling empowered, having something that gives them some kind of meaning or purpose or autonomy in some kind of way. Feeling validated in their feelings. Now, obviously, if somebody is in a really excited state and they're not sleeping for a week and they're engaging in a lot of really self-destructive behaviors, validating that might not be so helpful as much as validating what's going on underneath. Why is it that they are in this excited state? What kind of triggered this? What's been going on in their life that has brought this to be? The fear that somebody might experience, that intense fear that might lead to what people might call paranoia. It's not necessarily the stories that people tell themselves, but that fear is very real. And so being able to validate that fear, while at the same time being able to gently challenge maybe some of the less helpful stories or behaviors that somebody might be engaging in. And certainly, I'm sure it's not surprising to anybody that people find very helpful when people aren't judging them. And if we're really being honest with ourselves as clinicians, there's a lot of judgment that goes on. That the way people are talked about behind closed doors, the way diagnoses are used, especially personality disorder diagnoses, uh, the way that we pathologize so many things. There's just so much judgment, and people pick up on that even if we're trying our best to hold it back. A couple of quotes that you might have seen on the right side of the screen there. Those are from my dissertation, which, by the way, is also the basis of the book that I wrote. I think are super important and really get to the heart of what we're talking about here. One person said what was most helpful for them was having therapists that weren't scared of things, that they were open to being curious instead of kind of having all the answers. They were able to tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. That's what's been really helpful. Feeling witnessed in their pain instead of trying to just get rid of that pain. Uh, Somebody else said, when you stop medicalizing people's experiences and look at what's happened in that person's life and how these quote unquote symptoms are serving them, how they might actually be adaptive in the world, that's when you have a real chance to help them out. There's a saying that started out in some of the circles in England that's become very big now, and it's which gets to this kind of point, which is don't ask people what's wrong with you. Think about what's happened to you. Ask what has happened to you. And then this last one, any form of trying to make decisions for me has universally been very harmful. And that's where we get to the empowerment, why it's so important to help people feel empowered, even when they might seem like they are in a state where they can't make decisions. It's still important to know that this person is an expert on their life and to find the sense in whatever it is that they are experiencing or talking about. Now, obviously, when you look at what we as clinicians are trained and taught to do and often mandated to do, again, especially if you're working in a clinic, how this conflicts with what people are saying they need, right? If somebody is saying that what they need is tolerating uncertainty and ambiguity, or is being able to feel empowered, but then we're taught that we need to tell this person, you're in a state where you're unsafe, and therefore I think you need to go to the hospital. These are very conflicting places. Now, granted, they are both valid in their own ways. However, I think that to say that that one is always necessarily the right way or one is always necessarily the best way is itself a very black and white thinking and is not always helpful. I think instead it's really important that any kind of therapy, even if we're not talking about crisis per se, any kind of therapy has to be able to tolerate conflict, because it is working through that conflict within therapy, within that safe, trusted relationship. That's where so much change and growth and trust and a sense of safety really can come from. Oftentimes people, especially people who are in crisis, are coming to us because they've been abused or domestic violence, or because they themselves might be abusive, or because they avoid conflict and so are internalizing all kinds of anger and pain. They oftentimes do not know how to safely and healthily navigate everyday conflict, which we are all in conflict oftentimes. It's just impossible not to be. And so this is an opportunity where the clinic rules or your own, let's be real, your fear of liability issues, or your own existential issues, or whatever it might be, to be able to kind of bring that to the table as best you can, to try to be transparent with that and try to actually be able to navigate that conflict together, valuing the person who's coming for help as just as much an expert in that situation as you, the clinician, are. You have very valuable information to bring to the table. You have training, you have experience in certain ways, but that person who's coming for help also is an expert on their life. They have lived their life for however long, however many years or decades it's been that they've come to you, and they've managed to get through things that maybe you have never even been able to imagine is possible, that you yourself have not ever been through, and that has to be valued. And the more transparent as well, or vulnerable, that the clinician can be, and granted there's boundaries, and it's not a space for you to ever put your feelings onto the person who's coming for help. So within reason, but to some extent being transparent and saying, you know, listen, I don't necessarily know what the best answer is here for you. You're telling me that you don't feel safe. You're telling me that you want to die, and I don't want you to die. I don't want to see that happen. That really scares me. Sometimes just that moment right there can make a person be like, well, shoot, somebody actually cares about me. Imagine how healing that might be for that person in that moment. And just in that transparency, just in being honest, just in being able to have the respect for the person in front of you that I'm going to have a conversation with you as a human to another human in this moment. Sometimes that can pull them that little bit back from crisis. That might be enough for you to be able to do the work moving forward. Just as much as clinicians teach their clients, you have to yourself do the work so that you are not reactive, so that you are not just reacting on your fears, on your defenses against helplessness, on your own existential anxieties, on your own biased beliefs, but instead that you're able to be mindful, instead that you're able to take that pause between your initial emotional reaction and what you actually say or do. Probably most important in these moments where there is a conflict between how you're feeling or what your responsibilities might be and what the person in front of you might need or what they're asking for, is to really think not what's best in this specific moment, but what might be best long term. If I do X, is that going to lead to the destruction of this relationship? Is that going to lead to a temporary band-aid that is in fact going to result in a crisis that's 10 times worse a month from now? That often happens. And also just knowing like less is more. You might not always know the things you're doing that are unbelievably helpful. We feel like we have to do these big grand things in response to big intense emotions, but oftentimes it's the little things that actually stick with a person and really are taken in on the inside. It's also helpful in just talking about clinicians doing their own work, is to be able to reflect, you know, what is it that led you into this field? There's many different reasons people might come into this field. Ostensibly, it's probably because you wanted to help people. If it is about coming into this because you really want to help people, then it has to also be, well, am I really helping somebody, or am I doing something that makes me feel helpful? It's sometimes a very different answer. If the most helpful thing I can do to the person in front of me is to um, simply say, I'm scared that you're going to die, and nothing else, you do nothing else. And let's say that's the most helpful thing you can do. Does that make you feel helpful? It might not in the moment. It makes you probably feel scared and vulnerable. And so in that moment, as opposed to saying, well, all right, we're going to do this, we're going to come up with a plan, we're going to have a safety plan, we're going to have a contract, you're going to sign it, I'm going to call you at such and such time. If you're still suicidal, you're going to go to the hospital. That makes us feel helpful because we're doing things, it's very clear cut, it's concrete, we feel like we're actively doing something, but that's 9 times out of 10 not what's most helpful to the person in front of us. A lot of times, what brings people into this field is their own family dynamics. Not always, but a lot of times. And a lot of times, a person within their family played the role of therapist. And when a kid or teenager is playing the role of therapist in their life, that that usually can indicate a family dynamic that somebody tends to be an aggressor and somebody tends to be a victim and somebody tends to be a rescuer. The trauma triangle. I forgot who coined that term. They deserve credit. It's a thing that's out there. I encourage you to look it up. I apologize that I don't remember the person's name. But the trauma triangle, or sometimes it's called the drama triangle. But basically, in a lot of dysfunctional families, there's the aggressor, there's the victim, and then there's the rescuer, the person who's always trying to fix everything and make everything okay, and who's always there for everybody who is struggling. And when a clinician comes in as, playing that role as a therapist, that can sometimes be very harmful, because again, it's about feeding your own need to feel like you are rescuing somebody versus allowing somebody to learn how to rescue themselves. And that comes out more than ever during these times of crisis, because the person who really needs to rescue in these moments of crisis is going to be the person who's going to jump to try to fix everything, when in fact, that's usually the very thing that people are not looking for and find to be unhelpful. It's also really important for therapists and clinicians to really examine their own unhealed wounds. Like I said, most people are coming into this because of their own family dynamics or their own trauma history of some sort. And how much of that has really been worked through, and how much of that is still kind of a gaping, wide open wound that might be impacting the situation at any given time. And you know, we're living in a time right now, Black Lives Matters and all of this. Privilege is the word of the day, and it fits very much in this relationship as well. A clinician is in a very powerful position. They are in a position where they are considered to be the quote unquote expert. They are in a position where the decisions that they make have a lifelong impact on the person in front of them. The words they say can have a lifelong impact on the person in front of them. And I don't care how good of a clinician you are and how much you really respect the person in front of you, you can never get rid of that power differential. A clinician is always in a position of authority and privilege, and that's something to really be treated with kid gloves and to be appreciated, as opposed to trying to be gotten rid of or even ignored, or worse, being exploited. In general, what helps people when they are healing or when they are in a process of healing or growing and recovery? It's obviously a lot of things, a lot of things. It's never just one thing, ever. Here are some of the things. Again, relationships, the most important. People need healthy relationships in order to feel like they can, in order to feel safe, and in order to heal, and in order to grow. We are a social species. We do not exist in a vacuum, and we do not heal within that kind of vacuum from emotional and existential pain. Having peer support, other people who have been there, other people who have been through these sorts of experiences and perhaps might have ideas, or even just to be able to share in the experience so somebody doesn't feel so different or other or isolated. Being able to engage in actual dialogue, not being spoken down to, not being told what to do, but really being able to engage in a healthy dialogue and to learn sometimes what healthy dialogue even is. Making meaning in life, finding purpose, being able to laugh and play. Oh my goodness, how many people struggle to be able to just heartily laugh and feel playful in their life. Addressing social justice. There's so many people that are coming into mental health services that are oppressed or experiencing racism, or maybe it's because they're not as smart or as cool. You know, they stood out within, they were bullied in school or things like that. So it's really important to be able to consider those bigger social issues and the lack of social justice that people are experiencing these days. We got to consider environmental changes. Oftentimes, people who are in crisis, that crisis is a sign that something's got to change in their environment, that something isn't right. It's not necessarily that something isn't right up here, it's that something isn't right out here or within relationship, and that needs to change. Um, Mindfulness skills, it's a big fad these days, but there really is something to being able to learn how to ground yourself in the present moment, being able to really see what's around you, what's hear what somebody's saying to you in the moment, and to be able to sit in that moment instead of living in the past or always worrying about the future. Physical health is just as important as any of the other things that are being done within the therapy room. It cannot be ignored that this person needs to be eating healthy, and getting some kind of exercise, even if it's just walking for 20 minutes a day, getting nature. These things have been shown time and again through all kinds of different research to be incredibly powerful in helping a person. Sometimes they can be enough. I live in New York City. People sometimes forget to get out into the sun because you have to make a concerted effort to find nature or find sun, and that can be hugely, immensely healing and motivating for people. And of course, what's here is by no means everything, right? There's so many things that people find to be helpful on their journey, and it's important in the process of both in a moment of crisis, but in the longer term therapy to help that person find all of these different things that are outside of the therapy room. Again, going back to that need to be a rescuer, oftentimes therapy is this much for some people. It's very, very tiny, if anything at all. People do heal all the time on their own without needing to necessarily go to a therapist or a psychiatrist in order to heal from things. But then, of course, it is important that if you are working as a clinician, you need to know what helps in your role. I'm repeating myself for the most part, but repetition is important as well. In general, the best way that we can be helpful in a moment of crisis and also in the long term is to be open and be curious, to really ask questions instead of jumping to giving the answers, to be honest. We are humans, we're fallible, and it's important to be honest about that instead of promoting the idealization of us or pretending that we don't sometimes get scared or sad about things. Being able to, as best we can, treat the person in front of us as an equal. Again, we can never get rid of that power dynamic, and we can never really not be in a role of authority, but we can try our best to make that relationship as equal as possible, especially in a moment of crisis, especially, which then of course leads to collaboration. If you really respect the person in front of you, and if they are an expert in their own right, and if they are an equal member of this team that you have going, then it's about collaboration, working together to come up with solutions and answers instead of just one person telling the other person what to do. Helping the person find a sense of safety. Most people, when they are in crisis, it's because they don't feel safe in some kind of way, whether it's because there's literal safety concerns in the present moment, or whether it's because of past experiences or future worries that are making them feel unsafe in some kind of way. Tolerating uncertainty and ambiguity, encouraging the person to be autonomous, to find their own solutions, to do things on their own as much as they can. Obviously, there's sometimes stages to that. Being able to model what healthy behaviors and healthy expressions of emotions are, which of course then requires clinicians to really do their own work. And again, more than anything, being able to value that relationship. There's a lot of schools of thought out there right now that say it doesn't matter. You could replace any clinician with another clinician. It shouldn't matter. That has nothing to do with the work. And it's just not true. Anything that has done, any of the research that's been done from a first person perspective, from people with lived experience, again, over and over and over again, what is helpful is relationship. not technique or what is being said per se. It's about that relationship, and it really does matter. Uh, and that is all. So I think we're going to go to questions and answers now. It makes me very sad that I cannot see you and actually talk to you as if you were a person. I mean, you are a person, but a person in front of me. Nonetheless, I can't wait to hear what your questions are. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And I think that that should be mandatory viewing for all clinicians and students of clinical work. So I really, really appreciate that. Our first question, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but it's asking, has anyone yet encountered a situation where a peer specialist was named in a liability lawsuit when someone took their own life after a support encounter?
It's a pretty interesting question. Before I get directly to that, it does remind me of another thing that I think is important to say, because I know there's probably a lot of peers who are also on this this webinar. Uh, for all the things that I said about clinicians, it also goes for peers. Obviously, just because somebody's in a peer role doesn't mean that they don't have also the same inclination. We're all humans. We all have the same inclinations. We all have the same biases. We all have the same tendencies to not always be the most helpful people, right? And so peers are part of that as well. When it comes to actual liability, though, in general, most peers, not all, I know there are some organizations like what you have and what is going on in Massachusetts, where there are actual peer facilities that are separate from clinics and hospitals, but most peers do work under psychiatrists. And so if there was any liability issue, it would always go to the doctor. It would not, or the clinic or hospital, it wouldn't go to the peer. As far as the separate organizations like this organization or the RLC, Western Mass RLC or something like that, I don't know what would happen, and I don't know if anything has happened. It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. It would be something interesting to research a little bit. Our second question is also about peer respites. Says we have no peer respites in Oregon and have attention of a few legislators who are supportive. Is the comment you made about effectiveness of them documented in your thesis or published to use as a reference in communicating with our policymakers and those with budgetary authority?
There are some studies that have been done. My section in my book on peer-led services is very small. I don't remember actually if I don't remember if it's cited in my book, but I do know that there's an article that I wrote with somebody else, but I think it was just, I wrote it. I did write it with somebody else on Mad in America. That was back when Obama was, he had put in some mental health legislation that a lot of us were fighting against. And within that, there was a ton of citations that was on some of these peer respites and some of the research that's been done that has shown them to be at least as effective as hospitals. And certainly the most notorious is the Soteria houses from back in the 70s. And even now, some of the research around the Soteria houses, that's Soteria, where they have shown that they are just as effective, if not in some instances more so, than hospitalizations. I could find that link to the article on Mad in America if you want, and while you ask it, if I can find it now while except for I'm sharing my screen. Maybe Oryx can find it,
Yeah,
find that link.
just post the link to Mad in America and also to a website, peerrespite.net, which has some research on peer respites. I believe the National Empowerment Center, we've been updating our website recently with some studies showing the effectiveness of peer respites, some case studies. I think there's also a randomized control trial. So definitely look at our website. We have a section called, I think, Crisis Services, peer support, that has some research on there on peer respites and just peer support in general, which can be helpful. But yeah, if you can find the Mad in America article at some point that could be good to post. Um, our next question is, could someone share any literature out there on the effectiveness and other outcomes of some of these standardized practices? And any literature looking at clinicians' perceptions of these practices and policies related to referral, duty to warn, etc.
The most, as far as I am aware off the top of my head, the ones that have the most studies are looking at the predictive value of a lot of these questionnaires, like, and also the ones with safety contracts, and seeing does signing a safety contract actually lead to decreased suicidality. And in all of those, again, the predictive value is shown to be at most, like, I think it's just under 60%, which is basically a flip of the coin. And the social contracts are shown to not be to not be associated at all with a decrease in actual suicide attempts. And there's also, related to that, there is several studies that also show that, in fact, as people become more involved at higher levels with mental health services, that actually completed suicide increases as opposed to decreases.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for that. Yeah, I think there's also some good studies, yeah, showing specifically that involuntary commitment puts someone at higher risk for suicide.
Mhm.
And also, yeah, some studies on maybe the traumatic impact of, I think, hospitalization specifically for psychosis, yeah, can lead to PTSD symptoms.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that one showed that uh, that one I specifically know the study, Kim Mueller, um, that 30% of people who were hospitalized involuntarily for psychosis in that study, 30% met criteria for full PTSD as a direct result of that hospitalization, which is a lot. It's a lot
yeah,
of people.
that's a
Um,
big,
yeah. But to address the second half of that person's question, it was about, is there any studies about clinician perspectives on some of these
mhm.
procedures? I am not aware of any research out there on that, but I hope somebody does it, because I think that would be really important to know what are people who are doing these things actually even thinking about when do they, yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know if anything's been done on that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. That's something that I had been interested in even doing just like an informal survey on. Because I've been told that if I hold the position that involuntary commitment is harmful or can be harmful, then I have no right to be in the clinical field.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'd really love to kind of just get kind of a sense of how many other clinicians out there also feel that it can be harmful, because I think there are a lot of clinicians out there who do feel that way, or who are like a lot more hesitant to use it, but maybe do use it out of liability fears or because that's what they've been taught, but have concerns. So yeah, I think that's a really great idea.
The same with the questionnaires as well, just understanding what are people's perspectives on using those things and whether they find them to be helpful or not. It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Um, the fourth question is, do you have suggestions on how to support someone who is not getting good support from their doctor or therapist? What would you suggest to them?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you have suggestions on how to support someone who's not getting good support from their doctor or therapist.
How to support them, I guess that depends on the role somebody's in. How to support them, like as a friend or as a family member. Uh, I'm assuming that's where the person might be coming from. I think the best thing, that's a really tough one, because if the person knows that they're not getting, if they're saying my therapist isn't helpful, or I'm not getting the support I need from my therapist, then really helping the person to, number one, say that to the therapist. You want to talk about helping a person feel empowered and uh, uh, helping a person grow in some kind of way, man, if they can actually be able to assert themselves with their therapist, yes, yes, man. Um, but if, you know, that can be really hard for a lot of people too. So there are plenty of therapists out there. It, to stay with some, let me be clear, there's a difference also between therapists and psychiatrists. So if the therapist is unhelpful, there's just no reason to be going to the therapist. They're better off doing nothing. And but certainly they can find another therapist who's at hopefully at least a little bit more supportive or helpful than that person. Psychiatrists are a very much more difficult situation, because you can't just, if you're on various medications, you can't just stop seeing your psychiatrist. That's going to be terrible. And oftentimes there's not, especially if you live in a smaller town, or depending on where in the country you are, it can be really, really hard to find another psychiatrist. And so I think in that sense, it can be really helpful to maybe find some online support groups with people who have also had similar experiences. I had mentioned the Hearing Voices Network, and locally here, IDA, IDHA dash NY. I don't know if it's NY or NYC.org is the website. Also the Inner Compass Initiative, which Laura Delano started up, is a lot about stuff related to medication and some of the struggles that can come with that when a person doesn't always feel supported by their clinician. There's a lot of Facebook groups that people can be really supportive of one another. So that peer support can be really helpful when you don't necessarily have other options locally.
Thank you. Yeah. Those are great suggestions. Our next question asks, do you represent yourself to the client as having lived experience?
No, not because I'm afraid to, or it's 99% of the time irrelevant. In the time that I've been doing this work, I can only think of twice where I really thought my bringing some kind of my own experience into this room is going to actually really help this person. And in both times, it was because the person was so despondent and so hopeless and could not for the life of them believe that anybody could ever get through what they were going through and actually recover and have a decent life. And so in both of those instances, it was a very brief, hey, here's the thing that I also went through something similar like this, and look, I'm sitting here. And it was with somebody that I already had a trust. Both of those people were people I had very trusted relationships with. I think that it's a really tricky thing with that, because even with peer workers, obviously if somebody's in the role of peer worker, somebody already knows that that person obviously has that experience or has some kind of experience. But oftentimes you don't ever need to know what that experience is. That's not necessarily the thing that's helpful of hearing somebody else's experience. It's about feeling understood and seen and heard in a way that, like, oh, this person gets me. And so in that sense, I think actually a lot of people who have worked with me for a long time kind of probably already know something I've been through something, but they don't need to know what or any, because it just ends up taking over it changes the dynamic in a way that I don't necessarily know is helpful. Having
Yeah,
said that, however, a lot of people also do come to me through my website or because of my book or things I've written, and so then they already know before they've come to me. And still, I don't ever talk about it because it just never comes up and it's not relevant to the situation at hand usually.
absolutely. Um, Our next question is, what might be some general considerations for clinicians with lived experience as it pertains to one's licensure eligibility, continuance, or liability?
Wait, what was that second word?
Continuance, I guess.
I, I don't know what that means. Um, but as far as it shouldn't matter, it shouldn't have anything to do with anything. Uh, Now, granted, I don't know all the states, but I'm pretty sure that no states, I'm pretty sure there's certain states that might. But as far as I know, I don't think that there's any states that ask a question of, have you, I think they might ask at most, like, have you been hospitalized or fired from a job or something like that in the last 6 months or in the last 5 years or something like that, for a psychiatric reason, which is a valid question, because if you're still kind of going through something, maybe you're not in the best position to be a clinician. But I don't think that there's anything that ever asks, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness? That would shock me if there was a licensing question for mental health clinicians, in that regard. So I don't think lived experience would necessarily ever affect licensing in that way. As far as liability, the only thing I could imagine is some kind of terrible lawsuit where a patient is really out to like get you for some reason, and they're like, you've been diagnosed with such and such and such. See, you're crazy and you're terrible and you've ruined my life. That's the only time I could imagine that it would ever come up in a liability situation, unless you were actually currently and presently going through something, in which case that could get you into trouble for sure. But also, if you're currently going through something, maybe it's okay to take some time off.
I do want to add, I do think I do know plenty of clinicians who do still struggle from, with suicidal thoughts or with crisis from time to time, or yeah, with lots of different things. And I think, or right now, maybe everyone's kind of struggling with different things, and I think it's
It's true.
possible to still be helpful. Um, so our next question is, as a peer supporter, I am very encouraged to share my own lived experience with suicidal thoughts. Are there any situations in which a counselor might or could do that in a way that would be beneficial to the client?
Uh, Again, I think that it's just really individual. Um, and I think at any time, whether you're a peer, you're a clinician, if you're feeling the need to share, your own experience, I think it's important to ask why. Am I sharing because I just want to share? Am I sharing because I want this person to know me? Or am I sharing because I actually think it's going to be helpful to this person in this moment, because it's something they need to hear? And if it's the first two, then I personally don't think that you should share. And I think that that's a widely held viewpoint, because again, when you're in a particular role where somebody's coming to you for help or support, it's not really a place for you to say or do things based on your own needs. Um, it really should always be about, what does this person in front of me need and what is most helpful to this person at any given time. And so I think rarely is it going to be helpful for the person for you to talk about your experiences, though in some cases it might be.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very case by case. Um, our next question asks, can you talk more about how you use your lived experience to navigate crises as a clinician?
I think that, it's the culmination of pretty much everything I've been talking about. In moments where a person in front of me is in some kind of crisis, uh, I think that all the things that I said throughout this entire presentation are very much the way that I would approach it. I'm going to sit in that terrible place with them. I'm going to sit with the uncertainty. I'm going to acknowledge that, uh, I don't like how I feel right now. I'll acknowledge if I'm mad at the person, depending on what's actually happening. I'm going to be as real as possible with that person, and having had my own experiences, it also makes it a lot easier for me to know how those small things really can be helpful. And so sometimes I have to even remind myself of that, of like knowing, sort of trusting the process and trusting that the whatever is happening in the moment is probably helpful, even if I don't feel like I've helped at all. And in fact, usually that is the case. Um, and knock on wood. I mean, I remember during my internship, I explicitly told, but that's just because I'm a bit obnoxious. But I actively told my bosses, I was like, I will never involuntarily hospitalize somebody. Fire me. You just have to fire me. I just will never get my license. I don't care. Um, but deep down, I was always scared. Would I really, if it really came to it, would I really be that bold? I still don't know, because I've I've managed to be able to get through those situations without that ever being necessary. Um, yeah.
That's really incredible. Um, yeah, I've just received such like harsh reprimand for even saying like I don't think this is always necessary. So I think yeah, that's really cool that you just took a super bold stance.
Oh,
Um,
believe me, I've had plenty of reprimand, so it wasn't without reprimand.
I'm sure. Um, so what would be your advice to someone with lived experience interested in achieving a higher education, a PhD in psychology specifically? I have been warned to be cautious about sharing that part of my identity as it could be viewed negatively in academia. That's a great question.
Hmm. Uh, yeah, it is a really tricky situation. Um, a PhD program is really hard. It it's really hard because if you've had your own lived experience, depending on what it is, it's very likely you're going to constantly be triggered left and right, by the things that you're hearing people say, by the things that are being taught. It is really, really difficult to get through that and not say something. Um, and depending on the program, perhaps there might be programs out there. I mean, I was fairly thankful for my program that are more supportive, um, of various viewpoints, as well as various experiences that bring people to the field in the first place. But in general, I definitely would encourage to err on the side of not speaking about one's personal experiences, because it is often held against the person, and looked at in a negative light, and sometimes even can lead to being put on probation or not getting certain positions, or it can be a real problem. Obviously, it can be done. I did it. It's just, yeah, it's difficult. It's a tricky thing. So maybe the most important thing is really trying to find a super supportive program first and foremost, uh, that is open to alternative perspectives and a wider view of things.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. How would you suggest responding to a psychiatrist who insists on being on medication, even when side effects are unbearable and producing suicidal ideation because of akathisia?
I would suggest finding another psychiatrist.
Yeah,
I don't suggest arguing with a psychiatrist. I don't think that will ever get, obviously, if somebody is insisting on something and they're not open to dialogue, arguing with the person is going to get you nowhere, except just very frustrated. So either find another psychiatrist or just tell the psychiatrist what they need to hear, and um, yeah, find another psychiatrist. That's the only answer I have.
yeah, that resonates with me too. I just, in my experience, often you get pathologized for trying to argue, like you're told that you don't have insight or something if you don't want to take medications.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like the idea of finding a new psychiatrist. Um, and this person says, in my country, peer support and trauma-informed practice and are becoming increasingly popular, but also becoming diluted into tick-the-box regimes rather than meaningful change in service delivery. As
Mm,
clinicians, how can we support meaningful implementation of these principles and programs? I think this is true for the US as well.
absolutely. Um, Absolutely, for sure. Yeah. I think that as individual clinicians, I mean, this is true for anything, not just even talking about the subject we're talking about, right? Like, while we all might want to change the world, we usually can't. We can do our part, but usually, again, it's the smaller things that matter most. And so while we can't necessarily stop the broader trend and tendency towards checking the box and just keeping the status quo, which tends to happen, certainly in our own individual work, uh, we don't have to do that. So as an individual clinician, you might not be able to change the society around you, but you can certainly be mindful of how you are interacting and what you are doing with your own individual clients uh, and your own peers that you speak with and the people you befriend, and trying to get um, encourage people to think differently, uh, while again not getting overwhelmed by the fact that you can't change the bigger structure of society, because
Definitely.
it is definitely a big problem.
Um, yeah, for sure. I think this is our last question right now. How do you suggest to handle direct questions about your lived experiences when clients do have a sense of that?
Um, like I said, a lot of people do come to me because they're my book or my website or the stuff I write online or whatever. And so questions do come up about my lived experience, and usually it's more a matter of I will say whatever is minimally necessary to say to answer the question. I also am very much a psychodynamic therapist, so I'm very good at redirecting as well. um, I don't spend very much time on it. Uh, Only one person has ever persisted. Like, once I've tried to redirect, has asked me more questions, and in that moment, I felt like this person really does want to know, and I think it would be helpful to share a bit more. So I did share a bit more. Um, but in total, it took up maybe 5 minutes of one session, one time, and it's never come up again. Um, because it's usually not about them really wanting to know about me. They're wanting to know something else. And so it's about, all right, I'll give you a little bit, but like, really, what is it that you're scared about or worried about, or, and that's more important to get to, I think.
Absolutely. Another question did come in. When is it appropriate to involve a client's family members?
When the client feels it's appropriate.
Cool. Are there times when you like suggest it, or really you just let the client kind of decide?
I might suggest it if it's coming up in the course of, but it's suggested lightly. And it's usually because the person is indicating already that that might be an important thing to do. Um, and so it is a light suggestion. Uh, and I have brought family members in, even in non-crisis situations, sometimes bringing in a spouse or somebody just to help them kind of understand what the person's going through, or something like that. Um, but it's done with very, very, very clear boundaries and very explicit, like, the family member, this is not your space. I'm not going to reveal anything. Everything's going to come from the client. I'm here to support the client um, in whatever way they want me to. And you cannot call me, you cannot contact me. I will always, and anything you say to me, I will always tell the client. So I'm very explicit about everything in those situations. But again, it's always client led. But to be fair, I also work in private practice. I'm not working in a situation where necessarily I'm dealing with somebody who's, let's say, straight out of a hospital, and maybe in need of more intensive care, where I think those situations might come up a bit more of really
Right.
needing to involve the family. But even then, I'd still say it still needs to be client led.
That makes sense. Thank you. Um, I don't think we have any more questions at this point, but we do have a lot of positive comments. So thank you again for your webinar. I did want to just read one comment. Thank you for downsides as a peer support specialist connected to groups nationally. Many people find this type of response traumatizing, especially if it results in a hospitalization or civil commitment, and often leads to overall distrust of the entire system and less likely to seek support in the future. Absolutely. I'm actually helping on a study of Florida's involuntary commitment laws right now.
The Baker Act.
Yeah, famously known. But specifically the impact of a Baker Act on youth and young adults, and kind of their initial experiences in mental health treatment. And yeah, that's pretty much what we're finding, that it's leading to a lot of distrust and reluctance to seek any additional support.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's all the questions. Thank you again. I definitely learned a lot, and I think this was really great. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Our next webinar, we will be sending out an email to our listserv about that, announcing when that is. So please join us for that. Please be on the lookout, and we look forward to seeing you then.